Good.
Right. Good evening, and thank you very much to David van Wyk, who's from the Benchmarks Foundation. Welcome, and thank you very much for your time this evening, and thanks to other people who's also attending this short meeting. David, if you can just start by giving us a introduction to yourself. I mean, where you were born, where you went to school, where you did your education, and how you end up where you are at the moment. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I was born on the couch of mining house in Jansen Street, Dagbreek, Welkom, where my father was an apprentice mine worker and eventually became a mining engineer. My mother, who was a great admirer of Hitler, at the same time had great respect for Jewish doctors, and so the doctor at the couch was a Jewish doctor, and he misspelled my name with a V instead of a W. And so I ended up being David van Wyk instead of David. I don't know whether the Jewish doctor had some premonition about where I was going to go with my life and so on. But in any case, I spent my primary school years in Welkom until about standard 3. And then we relocated to Mozambique, where my father did the tunnels and excavations for the Cabora Bassa Dam for about 5 years. And I went to school in what was then Rhodesia or Salisbury for 5 years, boarding school. And then I came back to Voortrekker Hoërskool in Boksburg while my father was a mining engineer for Shaft Sinkers and Anglo-American. He spent most of his working life working for Anglo-American. And I did my undergrad studies at Wits. And on getting a Bachelor of Arts degree in social science, I left the country to go into exile in Zimbabwe in 1983, on the 13th of January 1983. And I spent more or less the next 10 years in Harare, where I was a teacher. I did my honors degree at the University of Zimbabwe, and I was responsible for some safe houses from Kontiwesizwe, along with Kali Hanekom, the former Minister Hanekom's brother. And I came back to South Africa 1992, end of 1992, spent some time in Mafikeng as a teacher until 1994. And then I worked for the government for 10 years, from 94 to 2004. I became disillusioned with the government. I was a senior member of the Communist Party in the province, a member of the provincial executive of that party, but I gradually came to the realization that Jesus will come before the Communist Party. It was a hopeless organization, and we were sitting in a provincial government that played soccer like Bafana Bafana a bit, in the middle of the pitch, never scoring, and be happy with a draw all the time instead of a win. And so I left the province. I came to Gauteng, and I joined the Benchmarks Foundation as a lead researcher. And I've been there since 2004 to the present, which is now almost 20 years.
Sure.
And yes, we've been very active as a small organization in working with communities that are impacted by mines, and not growing the Benchmarks Foundation as an organization, but rather growing the community's ability to engage with power.
Sure.
Both in terms of government.
I want to speak about Benchmarks Foundation just now, but I just want to go back a little bit and ask you about your time as a youth, and I'm especially interested in your time in Mozambique, and with your father being involved in the Cabora Bassa Dam, which I've always found quite an interesting project. knowing that area. Can you just tell us a little bit about your time there and some of your...
Well, yes, it was a very adventurous time for a little boy, between 10 and 15 years old. And I really enjoyed the time that we were there. Of course, we were surrounded by the Portuguese army. The Cahora Bassa project had a ring fence around it to prevent Frelimo from getting to it. And there were 80,000 landmines in between those fences that protected us from any attack by Frelimo. But Frelimo never intended to attack the dam. They created the impression that they wanted to, and the Portuguese concentrated all their forces around the dam, leaving the rest of the country undefended, which allowed Frelimo to sweep through the country down to Maputo, which was then Lourenço Marques. And basically, when the 1975 coup in Portugal happened, they virtually had control of the country. But it was quite interesting because we had to fly home. We couldn't go by road. The roads were ambushed all the time. And so we had to fly in and out of Songo, which was the village where we stayed, in Tete province in the north of Mozambique. And so I think that I grew up with the liberation wars of Southern Africa, because during that same period, ZANU-PF and ZAPU with ZIPRA and ZANLA began their wars in what was then Rhodesia. And that was also quite interesting in how an almost Maoist strategy led to the liberation of rural areas and the concentration of the colonial settler populations in the big towns and cities without them being able to move except in convoys or by air between the cities and the towns and so on. And I went to what was Bottershof School, high school, which was a Dutch Reformed church school in Harare. It's now called Eaglesvale. And it was a very interesting school. It had very interesting teachers, and it had a combination of the children of white farmers and Afrikaner orphans in what was then Rhodesia. And so that all made it very interesting. And it's interesting also that the Dutch Reformed teachers that were teaching there were more progressive than teachers in South Africa, I think, in many ways. And I'm quite glad that I actually had that opportunity of going there. And yeah, it's where my brother Johan wrote his first poetry and got it published in various magazines in South Africa. And he became quite a famous writer and poet in his own right in South Africa, and eventually a professor of Southern African literature at the University of UKZN. It wasn't UKZN then; it was Westville.
Okay.
Yeah.
I remember I obviously follow you on Facebook and often inspired by the posts that you submit there. I remember also an incident that you spoke of in Mozambique where you came. I think it was a little bit of the environmental stuff came in, where you went on I remember you referring to some hunting trip where people used to go and hunt often. And
yes. This is what always happens in these big projects. My father and them, and given our culture, everyone had a gun, and everyone, because there was a lot of wild animals in the area where the dam was being built, everyone wanted to shoot some animals and for the purpose of biltong and that sort of thing. And so whenever we had school holidays, my father and his friends, especially in the winter when it was dry and it wasn't raining, would go out at night with these searchlights on the back of Land Rovers and basically blind the animals with a searchlight and then shoot it from some distance. Of course, as with our culture, all of us want to have a gun, but not all of us know how to use it. And these things were quite chaotic. But in one Friday when we had to go, we actually didn't go. And some Portuguese guys did go, and they got blown up by a landmine.
Sure.
And I think that was when the hunting actually stopped. I have done some work in Mozambique recently in the last 6 or 7 years in the northern parts of Mozambique, in Tet province, around the coal mines at Moatize. And yeah, it's sad that the animals are practically all gone. The vegetation is, the trees and the forests and so on that were there when we were children are no longer there. Much of Central Africa is starting to look like the Free State now, Zimbabwe as well. And part of that had to do with what we consider to be progress, turning living things into dead objects. That's what we think is development, and it's not really development. We look down on an African village with mud huts and so on, where people pick the oranges from a tree and they eat mangoes from a tree and they dig their peanuts from the ground and things like that. And we say that is poverty. And those people are unemployed, when in actual fact they are not. They are living in a living environment, whereas we live in a dead environment. And we constantly want to push this idea that creating dead environments is progress and is development, when in fact it's not. It is destruction, and it's not sustainable. And we are now seeing the consequences of this. Including in the pandemics and so on that are hitting the planet, the issue of global warming and climate change and things like that, all the consequence of turning living things into dead objects for our consumption.
Before we get into the environmental talk, I just want to ask you, what motivated you to go into exile, and did the rest of your family go with you?
Well, I had quite an interesting history. When I was in matric at Voortrekker Hoërskool, I wanted to become a mercenary. I went into the army. I volunteered for 31 and 32 Battalion. I, out of a group of 30 guys who were trained for 31 and 32 Battalion, I came top of the class, and only 4 of us actually finished the course. I spent about 14 months in Namibia at 31 Battalion as a platoon sergeant at 31 Battalion. But then towards the end of that stay there, they detained my brother, and they beat him up very badly. And I came home for a 7-day pass in September of 1978. To find my brother unconscious in one military hospital. And I just decided that, there's something seriously wrong with the system that can do that. He was a pacifist poet, and so, that had quite an impact on me.
But sorry, how did that happen? How was he detained?
Well, he was the first political conscientious objector in South Africa. Everyone else objected on religious grounds. He refused to object on religious grounds. He objected on political grounds, and they didn't really like that very much. And so he was very badly beaten up by the military police while in military detention. And when I came home, I discovered this, and my mother was all in tears, and she wanted me to go with her to Pretoria to go and plead on his behalf and things like that. Fortunately, the International Writers Guild had a huge petition that got him released, and he was released on the grounds that he was schizophrenic and not fit for military service. Well, he then got his doctorate after that and became a professor of literature. So I don't think that he could have been very schizophrenic to be able to achieve those things and so on. No. But very often in Afrikaner families, you saw that in the Breitenbach family as well. In fact, with Jan Breitenbach being a very senior officer in the South African Defence Force, and the founder of 32 Battalion, and his brother being a poet, and are not seeing eye to eye, you know. And it's quite interesting because when Breiten was on trial in South Africa, his Vietnamese wife came to South Africa and she spent some time with my brother. Yeah, you know, it's these sort of small things that makes one begin to question the system and eventually realize that things are kind of wrong. They're not what the government tells you they are. I then went to Wits University after that to do my undergrad. I became very involved with student politics and the Release Mandela campaign and things like that. I'm also a silkscreen artist, so I did a lot of silk screens for Sharpeville Day, for June 16, for May Day, and so on. Well, when I was in my third year sociology class, or my second year sociology class, out of the 9 third-year students, 6 were detained in John Vorster Square at one time or the other, you know. So, yeah, the early 1980s, the government started becoming desperate about, you know, defending apartheid and defending the indefensible, and things started to fall apart very, very seriously.
Right. Thanks for that. A little bit of history, David. Yeah, I mean, I'm Afrikaner myself. My grandfather was born in a British concentration camp, and he also worked on the mines. I became a manager on the mines, and in the Second World War, he went to fight for the Allies in Egypt. But my father was also a very strong supporter of the Ossewa Brandwag at the time. I mean, the Afrikaners to me is always very interesting because it's difficult to pin down an Afrikaner. I mean, there's so many different cultures involved in being an Afrikaner.
I think at the point that you're making is a very interesting point, because my grandfather was a very staunch supporter of Jan Smuts and also fought in the war. He remained to his death a very strong supporter of Jan Smuts. And my father's family were very anarchist in many ways. They hated paying tax. They hated doing national service, not on political grounds or religious grounds, just for the fact that they disliked the state. They were really a wild bunch of mine workers and farmers, and very seldom went to church. In fact, my grandmother disliked the Dutch Reformed Church intensely, and she chucked the dominee out of her house in Paris because she said she could spend her money better on the horses than on his church. So yeah, it's difficult. And you know, if you look at the early 20th century and the urbanization of Afrikaners, there was strong socialistic, communistic, and anarchistic tendencies in that post-Boer period. On the other hand, my mother's family were staunch nationalists. Her mother was in a concentration camp in the Free State, and they absolutely hated the British. My mother still hates the British. You can't speak English in her house. She gets very offended if you do.
Wow. Okay. I know. Well, first, maybe you can say something about the Benchmarks Foundation and what it is that they do or you do, and how you became involved with them.
Well, yes, I resigned from government and came to Gauteng, and I had a pension of 250,000 rands in 2004, which I spent very quickly. Trying to set up a research agency. And I went to a workshop in Rustenburg, and there were these people there who said that they needed research on mining. And because I had worked in the province, the Northwest Province, for 10 years, I knew the situation in and out. And I said, well, I could do this research. And it was funded by the old Dutch anti-apartheid organizations, that first batch of research in 2004, into the platinum belt in mining on the platinum belt in Rustenburg. And that was Policy Gap, the first Policy Gap report that we did. And up to that point, no one had ever challenged the narrative of the mining industry. And we published it in August of 2007. The research took from 2004 to 2007 to produce, so it's very detailed. And in the week that we published it, Anglo had massive mine accidents. I think 6 mine workers died in that week. And we had a massive critique of their health and safety policies in Policy Gap. And so the media picked it up immediately. And Anglo, of course, was very, very angry about the research, but later on came to us and actually told us, no, the research is actually very accurate. It's true, what we are saying and so on, and what can they do about it. And so Benchmarks has become a bit like a Catholic priest. The mining companies come to us to confess their sins and ask for absolution, but but continue doing what they're doing, just like people in the Catholic Church do. They repent and then carry on with their sins until the next confession.
Wow.
But in the beginning, the mining companies were really, really hostile towards us. But we also took a different approach to research. And the approach to research that we took was that we don't just go into a community and do research, but we stay with that community and help them find ways of engaging with power and solving the problems that we identify, and moving forward. In a sense. The Benchmarks Foundation is associated with the South African Council of Churches, and me being a communist atheist, I have been working for them for the last 20 years, which is an indication of the tradition of the South African Council of Churches and the liberation struggle as well. And also the fact that the Council of Churches is still prepared to criticize government, regardless of whether it's the African National Congress or the National Party who is in power, which I respect them for, because it is important for people to speak truth to power and also to create voice for communities to be able to express the issues that affect them as a result of mining. You know, and if you look at mining in South Africa, it's now 150 years that we've had mining. And because of the very unique conditions of South Africa, it gave rise to a cheap labor system, which is ultra exploitative and very destructive of both people and the environment. And mining itself is not sustainable because mineral resources are not renewable. So you can't mine forever. You're going to reach a point where you have exhausted your resources, your mineral resources, and mining is going to end. And this is what we're seeing now in large parts of South Africa. In the Gauteng area, for example, we've still got 40% of the world's gold, but it's so deep and it's underwater that it's too expensive to actually extract it. And no matter what mechanized methods you use, you simply won't get at that gold. And so we find mines being abandoned, and we've got 2,000 abandoned mines in South Africa, and they're creating absolute environmental havoc and also huge environmental issues for communities and so on living in close proximity to those mines. And what we've also seen is a full circle where we started off with bucket and spade mining in 1886, and we are now back to bucket and spade all along Main Reef Road with
The Zamazamas.
people whom we call Zamazamas and so on. And we've gone right back to the 19th century, including the technologies and so on used. It's very interesting. We spend a lot of time on Main Reef Road and with Zamazamas and so on, and see how they operate and so on. And the media creates this hysteria around Zamazamas, but they're just ordinary people trying to make a living. And if you actually stop them from making that living, you will affect in Gauteng alone about 34,000 people and their dependents, which if you have a dependency ratio of 1 to 5 or 1 to 8, it's a good 250,000 to 300,000 people that will be affected, and will have an impact on the economy. You know, what little gold they extract actually pays their school fees, pays their rent, buys them clothes, buys them food, and things like that. And it is not about stopping Zamazamas that we should be thinking about. It's about how to regulate them and how to make them part of the mainstream economy.
Yeah,
In the Gauteng area.
I saw in a previous interview of yourself, you mentioned something that in some of these abandoned mines, there's up to 600 Zamazamas working at any point in time. So that surely they must be highly organized.
Well, yes. If you look at Crown Mines, for example, just near Soccer City, where we work with the Riverlee community who is not into mining at all and who is opposed to mining, they have abandoned mines all around them, and those abandoned mines have been infiltrated by Zamazamas, including the oldest mine in Johannesburg, which is at George Harrison Park on the corner of Nasrec Road and Main Reef Road. And the fact of the matter is that they are highly organized. They have very intricate systems, you know, and they have a division of labor as well that takes place. And if we look at the definition of what is an entrepreneur or a capitalist, they are the only entrepreneurs in this country, except for the taxi industry. They take huge risks. They have very little capital. They work in very dangerous conditions. They plan and organize extremely well. You cannot really call Anglo-American an entrepreneurial firm, or BHP Billiton or Lonman or Sibanye or any of these companies, because those people have massive support from the state, including state subsidies and so on. And the entire legal structure is geared towards making their operations possible, whereas the Zamazamas work against all odds. And if you look at the classical textbook definition of an entrepreneur, that's exactly what a Zamazama is. And maybe they should be recognized for that fact.
Tell me, how's the government reacting to the Zamazamas? Are they being heavily clamped down, or are they being allowed to do the mining?
Well, I think that there are 2 or 3 different kinds of Zamazamas. There's Zamazamas that operate on land that has been abandoned by mining companies, mines that have been abandoned by mining companies. And really you can't stop them because they're not really trespassing, because no one wants to own that land. And those mines are no longer operational. And there is no law against you taking rock out from underground. There is a law. Well, there's trespass legislation, and there's a legislation about being in possession of raw gold. But, you know, you can't say that a bag of rocks is raw gold until it's processed. And so most cases against Zamazamas, the police raid them, the police confiscate their equipment and they concentrate, and then they appear in court, and the magistrate simply throws the case out, and they back the next day, or they back the next Monday. They are usually raided on Fridays. What we find disturbing about the police raids is A, the violence of those raids, and B, the levels of corruption. The police would raid those Zamazamas who refuse to bribe them, and leave those Zamazamas who do bribe them alone. The police often work with syndicates, and very often the gold and concentrate and so on that they confiscate then ends up with the syndicates or with dubious mining companies who then get the gold into circulation, into the formal circulation. Then there's a second category of zamazamas, and they kind of ghost mine workers who operate in operational mines where there are still big mining companies operating on the West Rand and in Welkom and so on. Now, those guys work with the collusion of mine managers in the mine, because those mine workers go down, they stay underground for 3 or 4 months at a time. They get paid about 50% of a normal mine worker. They don't belong to trade unions. They don't have medical aid. You don't have to pay UIF. And when there is an accident, you can deny that you knew anything about them. Yeah. And that has been going on since the 1960s. It's not a new thing. I remember as a child in Welkom, there were lots of incidents like that. And those syndicates still operate in Welkom even to this day, to the point where a Harmony manager 2-3 years ago got shot dead for trying to stop the zamazamas in his formal mining operation. Now, those guys have to go down with the cages down the shafts, and they have to get past mine security, and everyday food has to be taken down to them, and month end they have to be paid. And you can't tell me that mine security can't detect them, you know. So there's a hell of a lot of corruption by formal mine managers and within the industry itself that no one wants to talk about and no one wants to investigate. And that is concerning. You know, that is where the real pilfering of gold goes, you know, apart from the tax evasion by big mining companies and so on, which cost Africa some $89 billion a year. You know, we calculated since 1994, South Africa has lost some 14 trillion rands in tax evasion and so on by big mining companies, false invoicing and that sort of thing. That is occurring, and the United Nations has investigated this and found this to be the case. The Thabo Mbeki Foundation also investigated this and found it to be the case.
We have also old abandoned mine close. Well, it's sort of semi-abandoned. There's talk of people wanting to mine it again, but there's also zamazamas. And one of the issues that I mean, obviously they work without any kind of protection in terms of personal protective equipment. And then the other thing is the way that they refine the gold is by, I think they use mercury to wash the gold, and it's straight into the river. So I agree that if there's some regulation, then obviously they you know, there could be some environmental protection as well.
Yeah, we met with the Deputy Minister of Mining 2-3 years ago, in which we made recommendations, and we part of the discussion with the DMRE about how to regulate zamazamas. We just made a big submission together with the National Association of Artisanal Miners and the Legal Resource Center about regulating zamazamas. And we would suggest that they form into cooperatives, that they cluster cooperatives, 3-4 cooperatives cluster together to form a secondary cooperative, that there be a central buying agency for the gold so that the syndicates can be excluded from the selling of gold, and that the zamazamas sell directly to the central buying agency. And that then from the proceeds of the central buying agency, the salaries of some engineers, geologists, and safety experts and so on are paid for to assist the zamazamas with mine safety and better extraction methods, and teaching them how to extract gold without having to use mercury. You know, so there are very concrete recommendations on the table that we have submitted to the DMRE. Every now and again, the Minister of Mining says, yes, they are going to legalize and formalize zamazamas, and they've tried to do so in Kimberley, but they haven't done so in a very supportive manner. It's a bit like land redistribution. You redistribute land, but you don't teach people how to use the land effectively, or you don't help them to mechanize or to be more productive or be more effective on the land that you give them. And then very often the land gets rented back to white farmers, or the land just gets occupied by thousands of people, and it no longer gets used for the purpose that it should be used for. So if you don't plan things properly, then you can't really transform things. You can only transform things if you plan for what you want to transform them into and how you want to make sure that there are no unintended consequences to these processes.
Yeah. Before we continue, I want to ask if there's anybody in on this conversation who wants to ask David a question up to this stage. I mean, you can quickly unmute yourself and ask a question or submit a comment. If I don't...
Hello.
Yes, Robbie.
Good evening. Evening, David.
Hi, good evening, Robbie.
Very interesting listening to you so far. The question I want to ask to you is, so I mean, looking at your background, being part of the Communist Party, do you believe that realistically and kind of in the short to medium time frame, do you think there's a better model or system to mining in South Africa as compared to, so I'm speaking specifically, let's say, nationalization of mines, of mineral resources. Do you think that that is a better system, or that there is a better way to mine? And then secondly, let's say there is a better system to mining. Is it even worth it, considering the social and environmental impacts, especially close to communities? Do you think that mining has a place in South Africa? And do you think there's a better system for mining in terms of social and environmental benefits? Cool, thanks.
Thank you, Robbie. That's a very good question that you are asking. In Ethiopia, they have 250,000 small-scale miners. They don't have any large-scale mining, but because it's well regulated, it seems to work well. In other African countries like the DRC, things are very, very chaotic. And if we don't begin to regulate effectively in South Africa, we will become the next DRC. And that would be a complete disaster. But I think that in South Africa, deep level mining has come to an end. It's no longer profitable to do so. And so the large scale companies are all leaving. BHP Billiton has already left. Anglo Gold Ashanti is leaving. I think Anglo American will leave probably before 2025. And the only one left standing is Sibanye. And I think that Sibanye is overextending itself. And at some point, it's going to have a crisis, an investment crisis, because it's buying a lot of mines that are not really profitable. And it is having to abandon those mines, such as Cook 1, 2, and 3 in Bekkersdal on the West Rand. I think that, so the scale of mining is changing. It's changing from large-scale industrial mining to small and medium-scale mining, which can be just as destructive if it's not properly regulated. But I don't think that one can look at mining as a platform for development. There are very few countries that have used mining successfully as a platform for development. And it's usually those countries that have very little mineral resources, like Japan, Great Britain, some of the Nordic countries, some of the European countries, and so on, who have developed without that stage of mining in between. So you can't really dig yourself out of a hole. is what I always say about the African National Congress's policy on development, trying to use mining as a platform for development. Because mining itself is not sustainable, it's hugely environmentally destructive. But I do think that one can develop a model, a small-scale, medium-scale model of mining, which is not as intensive as the current mining and far less destructive than the current mining that involves all people. And I think that when I talk about, or when I think about communism, I don't think of the Soviet Union Stalinist model necessarily. For me, communism is more about community. It is more about mobilizing communities to take control of not only their environment, but also of their development. And I see in South Africa now, communities are actually going to court to challenge the national government and the current system of governance to take control of government at a local level, as local residents, as ratepayers, as community members, and so on. It's happened in a couple of towns in the Northwest Province now, and so for me, the future of development, I'm sitting in Johannesburg in the middle of COVID-19, and I see all these empty shells of buildings around me, these erections to the male ego, which suddenly have no use because this pandemic has swept everyone out of the city and back into their communities as platforms from where to work. And I think that this is really the future. I think in the future we're going to have to abandon this model, which is reliant on massive mineral resources, these big cities and so on that we are having, and we're going to have to move back into communities. We're going to have to move away from highways and private cars and so on to communal and collective transport, and also to communal and collective ownership. Where as communities, we are responsible for the production of our food, we are responsible for the production of our needs, we are responsible for our health and safety and security and things like that, as direct participants in self-governance, rather than in reliance on a Father Christmas type central state, which does everything for us. And this is where people don't understand why communities burn down, let's say, a library and so on. And I've spoken to communities about that. They say, well, in the first instance, we were not asked whether we need the library. In the second instance, none of us were involved in building the library, and it created no economic benefit for our community. And in the third instance, the library is empty. There are no books in it. So why do we have this thing here? Unless we stop being paternalistic towards communities and actually engage with them and hear what they say about where they want to be in the future, we're not going to go anywhere. And people will say, yeah, but the same communities vote for the ruling party over and over. That's actually not true if you look at the election statistics. A minority of people have, vote for the ruling party. If we have, let's say, for example, a 60% turnout and half of that voted for the ruling party, that means that it's actually a minority rule by 30% of the total population. So the representative politics do not really represent democracy and participation by the people in self-governance and in what I would say the reclamation of the commons and of the public, of where we are as ordinary people, rather than this very hierarchical system that we are currently living in, which favors big corporations and empowers big corporations against nature and against people.
Thanks, David, for that. Did that answer your question, Robbie? You want to follow up?
No, I a lot to think about. Thank you. That was a great answer, David.
Thank you, Robbie.
You mentioned we've spoken a little bit about COVID, and I want to ask you a little bit about that. Firstly, what you mentioned, links between environmental degradation and COVID, this pandemic, and the likelihood that we'll see more of this in the future. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I think that with global warming at the moment, we are seeing a rise in methane in our atmosphere, and we're seeing a melting of the polar caps, and we're seeing the release of all kinds of organisms and germs and things like that that were trapped in the ice for millions of years. And we don't know what the consequences of that is going to be, apart from the fact that we can't really breathe methane. We breathe oxygen, but we are busy filling up our atmosphere with methane and carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide, all these things that we pump into the air that makes life on the planet impossible. Ultimately, we're turning the planet itself into a dead object for the sake of profit. It's not just our immediate environment that we are doing this with, and we really, really, really have to stop and say, we have to come to an end with this kind of thing. We had now in the last 15, 20 years, virus upon virus. You talk about swine flu, and you talk about avian flu, and you talk about SARS, and you talk about COVID, and you talk about, one upon the other, almost the economic crisis of capitalism, the boom and bust cycle that we are seeing contracting all the time and coming closer and closer as the system can no longer expand and there's no more living things to turn into dead objects. We are seeing the same thing happening biologically to us and our environment as well. So COVID has shown us that we can't have large concentrations of workers in a mine. We can't have large concentrations of workers in a building. We can't have large concentrations of workers on public transport, commuting from where they live to where they work. We need to begin to work where we live, rather than having this alienation of I'm not at work at home and I'm not at home at work. And COVID is actually forcing something on us that Karl Marx spoke about in the 19th century. He said that we are incredibly alienated because we are separated from the product of our labor, and the product of our labor confronts us as an alien thing, and we are also separated from the tools of our labor. All that we eventually have is just our human body, which gets exploited, and we are seeing the last frontier of mining being the human body, where people harvest human organs and so on, so that the rich and wealthy can live longer lives.
Yeah, and I mean also with the way that we make monocultures of everything and destroy through big mining projects, through big timber plantation establishment, through big agribusiness, we're breaking down biodiversity, and of course then the resilience inherent in biodiversity. So,
but we also create a monoculture of ourselves. We all start to look exactly the same. We dress the same. We all speak the same global language. We all adopt the same codes of ethics and things like that, which have been imposed on us. We that human diversity itself is becoming a monoculture, and pathetically so, because this is what people accuse communism of imposing. But in actual fact, we are being transformed by the advertising media and so on to all want to look the same and behave the same and consume the same and dress the same and so on.
Monoculture of the
when
mind.
In actual fact we need to get back to our communities. We need to get back to each other. We need to find that which binds us rather than that which divides us.
Exactly. I mean, we've been working with traditional health practitioners, basically because we are all concerned about environmental degradation, which means loss of access to the medicinal plants which traditional health practitioners use, and
Yes.
sacred spaces,
Yes.
and all of that,
Yes.
Just back to the COVID, I want to ask about this vaccine. Is the vaccine on, especially considering that the vaccine was developed in quite a quick spate of time, you think it's safe? Do you think that it's something that people should just go for without proper debate and proper, and and also just the last point is that this not just a way of enriching the pharmaceutical companies, which are already rich,
Well, I think that we've got two choices. We've got, in everything that we're doing on the planet, we've got two choices. We could go for the technological solutions, which are not solutions at all. They come with, unintended consequences and escalating problems. Each solution that we find that is technological brings with it new problems. For example, if we look at global warming, and the technological solution is electrical cars and so on, but electrical cars are based on manganese and a whole range of other minerals that are only found in poor countries in the third world, which will just lead to conflict in those countries and further environmental destruction. We actually need to rearrange society. And this is also in the manner in which we deal with pandemics and so on. We need to find a better way of living. We need to move away from consumerism. We need to move away from residing in big cities. We need to move away from the labor relations and relations of production that are dominant in our societies at the moment. Yes, we can find a vaccine, but this virus is already showing us that it comes out with new variations and new strains. It is constantly evolving, and it might just all the time evolve away from the vaccine. And in the South African context, we have the South African strain exactly because of our relations of production. The reason why it so very quickly adopted new forms in South Africa is because of the migrant labor system that we are having here. People are not working where they are living. They're traveling thousands of kilometers. And if you look at the statistics on the Migrant Labor Project report that I'm working at the moment, just before level 5 lockdown, there was hardly any COVID in the Eastern Cape. And then on the 26th of March, when it was announced that 3 days later there would be lockdown, it was on the 23rd of March that it was announced, everybody jumped in a taxi, a bus, and a bakkie to get down to the Eastern Cape. And they came through Gauteng, which was the epicenter of the disease. So they passed through Park Station, they passed through the big taxi ranks and so on, and the disease traveled happily down to the Eastern Cape. And the Eastern Cape very quickly became the third largest epicenter after the Western Cape and Gauteng after that. And then when level 5 was ended at the beginning of June, all those migrant workers came back again into the interior of the country, passing through Gauteng again. And if you look at the mining districts in the Northwest Province, for example, it more than tripled. In fact, it increased sixfold in Bojanala district, which is the platinum mining area in the Northwest Province, and fivefold in the Klerksdorp area, the Kenneth Kaunda district, where the gold mining takes place in the Northwest Province. And so I'm not surprised that the virus mutated under these conditions. And we are heading now for Easter, and we're going to have the third wave with Easter because everyone is going to be allowed to.
Yeah. David, you yourself had a brush with COVID, eh? How was it for you? What was your symptoms?
And you've got massive underdevelopment in the Eastern Cape because there's no one to employ there.
Yeah. David, can you tell us just a little bit about your own brush with COVID? I remember that you had COVID, but you didn't have to go to hospital, did you?
No, I went to hospital. I contracted COVID, I think, on the 16th of December in a crowded environment. I said to my former partner, I think I got COVID today.
Sure.
By the 24th, I was desperately confused and ill. My temperature was around 40 degrees consistently. And my daughter had to arrange an ambulance to come and fetch me and take me to hospital. Fortunately, I have very strong social relations around me with lots of people that I'm very fortunate to say I'm an assemblage of all the relations of society around me, all the people I engage and interact with. One person at my job, Brown Motsau, and a sister-in-law and my daughter took control of the situation. And I found myself in a very expensive clinic in Sandton, which I couldn't afford because I don't have medical aid. My daughter just said, don't worry about the money. And Brown and Sir Francis, through social media, raised the money to actually pay for most of that, together with my December income. And the other thing about a lot of COVID patients is that they die of isolation. You know, they die away from their families and so on. And these kids basically made sure that I'm in touch all the time. And they were in touch with the doctors all the time. So I had very detailed updates of what my situation was as a result of the manner in which my daughter and these two other young people managed the situation. And also, of course, the goodwill from absolutely thousands of people. I saw the lists of donations. You know, there were people who were donating things like 15,000 rands at a shot, and it absolutely covered the entire costs of my stay in hospital. There was a brief point where I slipped away. I just in the middle of one of the nights, I was miserable. I was having diarrhea. My temperature was out of control. I was confused and everything like that. And then suddenly I just slipped away into darkness, and there was no pain. There was no issues. I was extremely comfortable. And the thought went through my mind that you're dying. And I was very comfortable with that. And then a couple of minutes later, I woke up again, and I was back with the diarrhea and the temperature and everything else. And well, my feeling is if that is what dying is about, it's not so bad. It's just that we are all very afraid of dying because we don't know what it is, because no one comes back to tell the story.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to be at peace with your life, you know, because then I think it's easier to accept the end of it. I think I often reflect about this, the interrelationship of us on a kind of a global level, and these changes that you are talking about in terms of, I mean, it's all interrelated to global economy, and I think these changes need to happen on a global scale. Do you think a country like South Africa on its own can if a country but obviously it has to start there, but can you just reflect a little bit about that global interconnectivity? For example, mining, you know, because the gold mining might be nearing completion because the gold reserves that's easily accessible is finishing. But there's many other minerals and things which people will continue to mine and continue to exploit the environment.
Well, I think that global interaction and globalism, one looks at it, and from my perspective, dialectically, you look at it in terms of it's got very oppressive aspects to it, very exploitative aspects to it, but it can also have liberating aspects to it. You know, it's like everything that we do has two sides to it. And it really depends on how these opposite sides, the Chinese talk about what yin and yang, everything has its opposite. And it's exactly these opposites that allows us to move forward in a manner that's either progressive or destructive. And I'm afraid to say that the billionaires have so much influence in the world at the moment, the handful of billionaires, that they're actually dictating the direction we are going in. and that is dangerous. The only looking at a vaccine as a solution is not a solution, because it doesn't really change the conditions which give rise to pandemics like COVID. It doesn't give, it doesn't pay attention to the conditions which give rise to the destruction and so on that we're seeing all around us. And we really have to engage with globalism in a progressive manner, in the sense that we need to take control of how we engage with the people from the rest of the world. We can't isolate ourselves from them. But at the same time, we should not see that engagement as one of consumerism, and we should not see that engagement as one that is technological. We can see that what technology has done with COVID came by aeroplane, it came by air. It came with what I call the globe-trotting classes. The first point that COVID hit was OR Tambo. The second point was Sandton. And then from there, it hit the domestic workers and the gardeners of Alex. And then from there, it got onto the taxis into all the other working class areas in the country. It is that utter dependency of wealthy people in Sandton on domestic labor, which saw their domestic workers coming to work even during level 5 lockdown. That took this thing back into the poorest and least, the most vulnerable parts of our country. So it's all about social relations. It's all about how we engage with each other, how I engage with you, how I engage with my neighbor. People always want to say to me, but David, who is going to lead us? And I always say, there's no one who is going to lead us. Look in the mirror and see the person who's going to lead you. Look at your neighbor and see the person you have to walk with. Don't try and lead other people, rather walk with them, walk with them towards a different future. And this is the tragedy of South Africa also, in that we don't seem to be able to break out of the confines that we have created for ourselves in our social constructs. When I worked in government, all the guys in the civil service who came from my Afrikaner background went to sit in one corner. All the Indian guys went to sit in another corner. All the Tswanas went to sit in another corner. And instead of people finding each other, people use their social constructs to isolate themselves. And it is exactly this self-isolation that allows us to be exploited, that allows us to be oppressed, and that allows us to be the victims of a world created in the image of Bill Gates or these billionaires that really dominate society at the moment.
Yeah. But I mean, it's also important, of course, as you've mentioned before, diversity is important, and I mean,
diversity is important, but diversity should not be exclusivity.
Yeah.
And this is where we confuse. In South Africa, we confuse a lot of things. We think discipline is violence. If you are violent towards a child, that child will be disciplined. In the meantime, that child is just fearful. We think that diversity is exclusivity. I must exclude myself from everyone else. That is what makes me diverse. And that's not what it is.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I just want to get back to the mining, and thinking specifically about the Gauteng area and Egoli. Was it worth it? From a monetary sense of view, I mean, if you quantify all the costs associated with mining, all the tremendous amounts of pollution that needs to be cleaned up, or that might never be cleaned up, all the people that have died due to diseases from mining, you think it's worth it? Do you think it's economically, if you really consider all the costs?
Well, I think that first and foremost, we must look at the opportunity costs as well as at the impacts. When mining started in 1886 in Johannesburg, this was an interesting town. It was a town of fountains because it's the watershed between the Limpopo and the Vaal. And whatever rain falls on the watershed that runs off on the northern side of the watershed ends up in the Limpopo. And whatever falls on the southern side ends up in the Vaal and in the Gariep River. And you have Terfontein, you have Stilfontein, you have springs, you have so many fountains names. You know, Johannesburg has an aquifer below it the size of Lake Kariba. Okay, and it is an aquifer that we are systematically destroying. And water is going to become the most important resource on this planet, worth far more than gold. And it's interesting, I work a lot in Africa, and a kingdom in Solwezi in northwestern Zambia say they define their kingdom in a drop of water.
Yeah.
And they already understood in the 1950s and 60s already that water is of paramount importance. And I worked with those communities fighting First Quantum from Canada, who wanted to take 2,000 square kilometers of Zambian land. And we actually managed to get them down to about 120 square kilometers, which is still massive. But we lost so much opportunity because we went for a mono economy based on mining.
Yeah.
What were all the other economic alternatives that could have been here, given the amount of water that is here? You know, the subterranean water that is here. And this is what is happening in the Okavango now with this Recon Africa that wants to frack in the Okavango Delta and drill for oil and gas and so on in the Okavango Delta. Much of our water in South Africa comes from that delta. It sinks into the desert there and it comes up in aquifers all over Southern Africa. And we destroy that source of water that starts in southern Angola and ends in the Karoo. And we are basically starving South Africa and the whole of SADC of any water. You know, and I think it's criminal that profit is put before the future of humanity, before the future of future generations. We can see the destruction that was caused by mining in Johannesburg. If we look at the situation, the health situation in Soweto, in Snake Park, in Meadowlands, in Diepkloof, in Rivoli, and so on, where those people are desperately sick from mine dust, and no one wants to admit it. No one wants to do anything about it. You know, where the rivers that run through Soweto is absolutely toxic, and no one wants to admit it. No one wants to do anything about it. And that is where we dumped the people who work and keep the city going. You know, they all live in Soweto and these places. I've become ill a couple of times from having worked in Soweto, and my doctor told me, it's because you are working there. He said it's a cesspool of disease. That's what he called it. It's a crime against humanity. You know, we should actually relocate all those people away from there. It's not a habitable environment, but we actually romanticize Soweto and we make it into a tourist attraction. I suppose the future of tourism under this current system, this current global system that we are having, is to go and look at ill and diseased people in these areas that we made uninhabitable on the planet.
Can I ask, why is it so specifically bad in Soweto itself? I mean, I understand it's got to do with the mine dumps, the tailings and the dust and the radioactivity of it.
Well, I think Soweto is in a basin. It's in a geological basin. So it's lower than the ridge that makes up the Witwatersrand. So all the water that runs off the Witwatersrand runs into Soweto. And in between Soweto and the ridge, of course, is all the mine dumps along Main Reef Road. That's the first problem. Is the location. The second thing is that wind direction. We did wind studies in Soweto, and about 90% of all wind comes from the north and the northwest, and it blows across the mine dumps into Soweto. So, and because it's in a basin, it gets trapped there. It's like a dust bucket, basically. And the reason why people were located there is exactly because it was economically the least viable land in Johannesburg. And
so
also
people
the
were
most dangerous
aware
land to
of
be on.
those risks already at that time when.
Well, yes, I think that you had an outbreak of the plague in Johannesburg in 1904, and of course the white population of Johannesburg immediately said it was the what they called the slums, the Muslims and the blacks, living in Fortsburg, living in Brixton, living in those parts, Sophiatown, and so on. And they demanded that these people be removed. And Kliptown, the first part of Soweto, actually started soon after 1904, when the first groups of Asian and black people were dumped. And that was also where Johannesburg sewage works were located. People were happily pumping all Johannesburg sewage into the Klip River, which is at Klipspruit, which is where its source is. And if you go on the N1 to Bloemfontein now, you still see the sewage works of Johannesburg are located exactly there. And this is where, poor people always get dumped where rich people dump their refuse, where they dump their shit, basically. That's where poor people usually get located. And that is common all over the world, except that in South Africa it had a racial dimension. The interesting thing about Soweto's history is that they couldn't find enough money to relocate everybody, and so they introduced a employment tax. For every black person that you employed, you had to pay £1 in tax, so that they could build houses in Soweto with that money. And they also introduced traditional beer, and they made it illegal for black people to drink any other alcohol, so that they could raise money from selling traditional beer to them, chibuku and so on, in order to build houses. But they had a problem because no white builders would build in Soweto, because the color bar legislation said that black people could not lay bricks. They could mix cement, but they could not lay bricks. And no white people wanted to build houses for black people. And so in 1948, when the National Party came to power, it
David, you just disappeared there for the last 10 seconds. Hello?
What did you call them? Rapportreiers or whatever, Brandwag or something like that. I can't remember what they were called. They demanded that the mines be nationalized. It's interesting how history repeats itself. And so Malan and the first prime minister and so on went to Oppenheimer and said, look, the National Party Youth League is demanding that the mines should be nationalized. What are we going to do about it? And Oppenheimer said, okay, no, we will create conditions for Afrikaner capital to move into mining, Gencor and so on. And the first mines they sold to the Afrikaners were the asbestos mines. And so Afrikaner capital sat with all this asbestos that no one wanted to buy, because people already knew that it was dangerous. And so in the relocation of black people out of the white areas between 1955 and 1965, Gencor and the asbestos mining companies made huge amounts of money from the projects of roofing the townships with asbestos. And so basically they traded the lungs of black workers for the creation of Afrikaner capital in the form of Afrikaner mining companies that started off as asbestos mines, and later on diversified into platinum and gold and other mines. If you trace back the history of Impala, for example, it goes right back to Gencor at that time. This is interesting. So you're sitting in Riverlee, Zone 1, with 100% asbestos to this day. You are sitting in Diepkloof with about 70% asbestos, in Meadowlands with about 60% asbestos roofing. And the new ANC government goes and it steals the money for the asbestos replacement after asbestos gets banned in 2008. And this is what the Ace Magashule case really should be about, is the lungs of the working class in this country, because there was an opportunity to replace all the asbestos roofs, but the money vanished.
Yeah. I must just tell you that I was in the early 1980s. I was in Afrikaans Hoër Seunskool in Pretoria. And we also had a couple of classrooms that were made from asbestos.
Yes, to this day, in very posh schools in Johannesburg North, there are still asbestos classes. At Roosevelt High School, there are still asbestos classes and so on. But there was a program to remove all that asbestos, and the money disappeared.
Sure. I want. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but I don't think relocation is probably not something that people will go for. What do you think is the solution to this? I think I heard somewhere you talk about some kind of plant that can be used, the magnolia, cannabis, some kind of plant that can be used to.
There are plants that you can use to extract the uranium and heavy metals from the soil, the arsenic, the lead, the uranium, the copper, and the iron, and so on. The asbestos simply has to be removed and replaced. But the other problem that you are having, and Mariette probably told you about this, is that the void, the central void, the western void, and the eastern void, basically the mined out areas, of filling up with water. And because, in before mining, you had dikes, which is layers of very hard rock going down at an angle where lava poured into cracks in the earth. In between the dikes, you have dolomitic rock, which is very absorbent of water and so on. And this is what created all the springs and fountains that you find all over Johannesburg, well, that were here before mining. And mining perforated the dikes, and so the springs no longer occur where they used to occur. And you go to Davidsonville playground, for example, next to the primary school, and you have acid fountains popping out in the playground. Sure. So every rain season, the water table rises, and it rises in these old mine shafts and so on. And it gets in touch with oxygen, with pyrite, with copper, and so on, and it becomes acidic, and it leaches out what uranium is still there, and it pops up as fountains all over the place. Fountains that no one could predict. You can wake up one morning and there will be a lake on your lawn, or something like that, and it will be full of acidic water. The other thing, of course, is that when the dolomitic rock gets eaten by this acid water, you're going to have sinkholes. And you already saw last week in the Sowetan the huge sinkhole in Tucson that took away a whole house. In May 2014, there was a huge sinkhole on Main Reef Road. There's a bed factory right next to River Lee where there's a massive sinkhole formation taking place in the backyard of the factory. You've had sinkholes in Springs and in Boksburg, Jerusalem, where that child disappeared some 5 years ago or so while playing soccer. And this is the future of Johannesburg South, Soweto, all the parts to the south of the reef, because the mines went down vertically and then they went in tunnels towards the south to hit the reef, which was in a slope, a 45-degree slope, and to constantly hit the reef to take out the gold from that particular reef. So the southern parts of Johannesburg are heavily undermined, and the combination of acid water, dolomitic rock, and the rising water table spells disaster. So parts of Soweto will have to be evacuated and relocated, whether they like it or not.
Sure. So there's no like a physical solution to. I mean, it just.
No, look, in River Lee, we made a project proposal where there is undermined land which is in the process of being rehabilitated, of putting lightweight housing on top of that land, which is not too heavy on the underlying substructures and so on, and to make the roof of each house into a solar panel to create a solar farm of housing that will sell electricity back to Eskom. And generate an income for the occupants of the houses, because in Rivoli, most people are unemployed, they have no income. If you replace the asbestos roofs in Rivoli, for example, with solar roofs, not panels, the entire roof is a solar panel, each household can generate an income for itself. And in generating an income for itself, it can then begin to address the problems that are faced by the children in that household in terms of education and their human development. The problem is that we're not looking at development from a environment and human development perspective. We're only looking at development from the perspective of profit and self-gain. And so the solutions that we come up with are not solutions that are sustainable.
Yeah, in a way, we have to go back, and go back to a more simpler form of life, a simpler form of energy, and I'd like to touch on that a little bit. We're really energy hungry as a society, and I don't know if you watched that movie. Planet of the People. Yeah, I think it's called Planet of the People. Michael Moore and his sort of very critical look on solar energy, on biomass, and also wind generation. Where for example, solar energy, it's actually quite expensive to set up a system like that, and of course, with the batteries that you require, with the mining that's still necessary to produce the panels, it's not all that renewable. It doesn't last that long. But obviously, it's better than coal. But it's also that it's difficult to think that solar can give us the demand that we need. And I just want to ask you about your thoughts on nuclear energy, and if you know about nuclear energy from thorium, using thorium and not uranium as your main input. Do you know about that?
Well, look, for me, the problem with any form of mining solutions to energy problems, whether it's thorium, uranium, or solar, is the fact that no one looks at, when they look at the supply chain, they always look at the supply chain in terms of the end product. And for example, with nuclear, what to do with the waste and so on. And for me, that's not the problem. For me, the problem is in Snake Park when I get there and I find that there is a child with cerebral palsy in almost every street. And no one talks about that. No one talks about what is happening to communities in close proximity to large industrial scale mining. And I think that we need to move away from large industrial scale mining. And I also think that we need to do the minimum of mining based on need, on human need. And we need not define human need on the basis of consumer society. We need to define human need on the basis of basic human needs, not extravagant human needs. We should stop this culture of everyone wants to be a billionaire. It really is not sustainable. And if we talk about a thorium solution, which I don't know all that much about, all that I know is that it will involve mining, like with all the other solutions. And therefore, it might be a problem.
do you think that a diversified sort of solar grid, wind generation where possible, do you think in a diversified energy mix, what do you think is the solution to our energy crisis?
Well, I think the first solution to the energy crisis is to stop slavishly following the philosophy of growth at all cost economy.
Yeah.
And I think that the solution lies in different social relations in our society, both of production and other relations, where where those of us who are very privileged and wealthy accept a lowering of our standard of living so that we can slightly raise the standard of living of the rest of the population, and so that we have a less impactful existence on the planet and on our resources and so on. You know, we really have to look at ourselves and what it is that we are doing that is destructive, and how do we minimize that or those levels of destruction that we are talking about. And people will often say, yeah, well, the planet is overpopulated. The planet is overpopulated perhaps, but sociological research has shown over many years that if you achieve a certain level of a certain standard of living, people naturally have fewer children. And the poorer people are, the more children they will have, because it's a survival strategy. So you can't preach to people that the planet is overpopulated when you have a distribution of resources which is highly unequal, especially in the context of our country, South Africa. You know, I had the opportunity of taking Cuban visitors from the Cuban embassy in Pretoria down to Mafeking in the Northwest Province while in government. And they were absolutely horrified by the obvious division of wealth in the country. As you travel through towns and you hit the township first, or you hit the squatter camp first, and then you hit the leafy suburbs afterwards. Everywhere it is obvious that we have massive inequality in this country, and we need to deal with it. And you and I, who are the beneficiaries of that privilege, need to begin to think about, well, I'm part of the problem. I'm my lifestyle is unsustainable, and my lifestyle is also unfair and unequal. We need to do something about that, and unless we are prepared to do something about that, we are just going to end up in more crime and more conflict and more violence.
Yeah. I think again that's also related to a kind of a global model of development which we as a country are sort of following, and that there needs to be kind of a global change, you know. And I'm thinking again about COVID and how that has impacted, for instance, the aviation industry and this sort of luxury kind of travel and tourism. And I think, you know, even this kind of Zoom meet, to me, it's never made sense for environmentalists to travel all around the globe to talk about the environment. Whereas, I mean, that's a certain way of lowering your carbon footprint is just by not flying that much, you know.
Well, it's an important point that you're making. You know, we travel down to Cape Town every year for the alternative mining Indaba, flying there and back, and that's a huge problem for me. You know, we should actually be taking other forms of transport down to Cape Town. Even if we take a couple of weeks off and cycle down to Cape Town, we will make a big point to have an alternative mining Indaba rather than flying or consuming fossil fuels and things like that to get to the alternative mining Indaba. You know, so we as very privileged environmental activists and so on also need to consider how we operate. And we are often confronted with this in the townships. You know, people say, but you are not living this this dystopia that we are experiencing. What gives you the right to talk about it? What gives you the right to engage about it?
Yeah.
And it's my response to my position on apartheid and what it was in 1983. I'm not joining the struggle because I want to liberate Black people. I'm joining the struggle because I want to liberate myself from what is causing the conditions that gives rise to a struggle.
Yeah. So we look into the mirror and we see our enemy, you know.
Yeah,
can I
we
ask
look
you
yeah.
your thoughts on Greta Thunberg, the young activist from Sweden?
Sure. Well, look, you know, it was great that Greta went and sat outside the school and said, I'm not going to go to school anymore until people begin to address the issue of the environment. In a sense, school is what turns us into sheep in the consumer society. You know, and the whole socialization process that is involved with schooling and education needs to be rethought as well. You know, education should rather take place in the commons, in our communities and so on. Where I was sitting at Wits the day that the protest broke out a couple of days ago, and it has become a fortification from the time that I was there. No one can go in or out of there without there being tight security control. And that's not what a university should be. A university should be open to the surrounding public. It should be a place of ideas and of sharing and of caring and all of these things, of evolving new common knowledge and practice and so on. And so she has taken attention, but like with everything good, the system co-opts it. You know, it's like Che Guevara T-shirts. It becomes a pop culture symbol that sells shirts instead of anything of meaning.
Yeah.
And I think that the system has realized this now. Since the student revolts of 1968, they've worked out how to co-opt protests and struggle. You know, you saw Ace Magashule 2 days ago taking over the student struggle and making out as if it's an ANC struggle, when in actual fact it's an ANC problem.
Yeah.
You know, and the ANC have become past masters at this, you know, where allow people to protest and then pretend that you are actually the champions of the cause of that protest, you know, and that diffuses the situation. It takes the sting out of the situation. I think that's what happened to Greta as well. You know, if she really posed a challenge to the system, they would have shot her by now.
Yeah, sure. And your thoughts on old Donald Trump? I'm a little bit sad that he's gone, because it was quite funny to now there's no news out of America anymore, you know.
Well, I think two things. Donald Trump was the champion of fossil fuels. He was the big champion of oil, coal, and so on. So in that sense, it's a good thing that he's gone.
Yeah.
But Biden is the champion of solar energy and all these things, and therefore of aggressive mining. You know, I don't know. There's a very interesting book that I've got here, which is the race for what is left.
Yeah.
And that is what is taking place, you know. So Biden is bad news for us in Africa and in South America and so on, where we've got cobalt, where we've got copper, where we've got manganese and so on. You know, I just did a study on manganese from South Africa, and the way it's being plundered in the Northern Cape is just awful. All trucked down to East London and Port Elizabeth to be shipped out of the country as quickly as it gets in. It's absolutely critical for solar energy and alternative energy and so on. And we are just allowing it to be stripped, basically, with no benefit for South Africa whatsoever.
But is that not a case of Africa where it seems as if Africa has got no control over its own resources and it's just being used to
it's the
fulfill
same
the
as
needs of others?
same as South America, yeah.
Yeah.
Same as Colombia, same as Chile, same as Bolivia.
Yeah.
The same as all the countries that had been colonies in the past. You know, we simply don't have control over our own countries because we don't own our own economies. In South Africa, we have a country where 80% of the people own nothing except their ability to work.
Yeah. Sure. And that article that you also just circulated recently about France being the biggest seller of timber, but they don't have any of their own timber. You know, it's just crazy.
Well. I think that Switzerland is the biggest exporter of gold and platinum. They don't have gold and platinum mines. They have more gold processing plants in Switzerland than in the whole of SADC. Britain is the biggest exporter of rough diamonds in the world. They don't have any rough diamonds in Britain. They don't have any diamond mines in Britain. You know, one can go on and on and on and on. The same with Belgium as far as diamonds are concerned, and so on as well. You know, so it is pretty common that what is in Africa doesn't belong to Africans. It belongs to Europe, and those relations that existed under colonialism continue. They only have the Europeans have only realized that it's better to have black politicians managing colonies than to have white settlers managing African colonies. It is less politically damaging to the image of Europe, but you can still get all the minerals just the way you did under colonialism.
Yeah, but that's all still chasing this current model of development, which is based upon the resource exploitation. I want to ask you, how do we change that? Because that seems to me a fundamental problem. How do we change it?
Well, I think that there was a slogan in the 1970s and 1980s which said, "Small is beautiful." I think it is probably still true. I think that in the vision of a communist society that I have, you will start in your community. You won't start with the state. In fact, you want to do away with the state as much as possible. And you do away with the state by taking politics out of boardrooms and out of these fancy parliament buildings and things like that, and bringing it back to the people. And you can see, people think that townships are very violent and so on, and rural communities are very violent and so on. But that violence stems from the fact that no one wants to listen to them, and they only get listened to when they burn something. And the other thing is that whatever development, the political parties want to be seen to be the people who deliver the Christmas presents to the township and the rural area. They don't want to involve the people of the rural area or the township in their own self-development, because then the political party would no longer be necessary. And so in Cajamarca, in Colombia, I worked with a community where we worked with them towards having referendums about mining, and in which they rejected mining in their referendums and stopped mining AngloGold Ashanti dead in its tracks. And they eventually took over their towns as communities, opposed to mining, rather than having these political parties coming in for elections. They started actually winning their own elections and representing themselves, and engaging in their own issues and problems and so on, towards solutions. You can go and read on Google about the La Colosa mine in Colombia. And I think that in the South African context, as I said right at the beginning, we change all that by starting at a community level and seeing what our community needs, what needs to be done. There's plenty of work in South Africa that needs to be done. You know, we have schools to be repaired. We have health facilities to be constructed. We have the environment to be cleaned up. Just cleaning up this mess from mining can create absolutely millions of jobs in this country, and in the process generate alternative things for people to do into the future. You know, and in any case, you know, we need to change this thing called jobs or work. What does work mean? We need to go back to a situation where we say work is about what I do to make sure that I have shelter, clothes, and food, basically, and good health. It is not about having a Jaguar or a Mercedes-Benz or flying around and all those fancy things. Work should be about basic things. And then the second thing is, how do I contribute? Because now here I am. I'm a paper pusher. I do nothing to secure the house. I don't build the house that I live in. I don't plant the food that I eat. I don't make the clothes that I wear. I just push paper, and really the work that I do, most of us paper pushers, the work that we actually do is not really necessary. We just do it because we want to pretend to be working, and in our pretense we get the cream of what the social product is, and the people who actually produce the food get nothing. They starve. They can't even afford the food that they produce. You know, you get the farm worker who looks at the packet of maize meal in the shop and think, my God, how am I going to eat this month? Because my income isn't enough to buy this maize meal, even though I'm the one who planted the maize and saw it growing and harvested it and so on. You know, that alienation, we need to overcome that alienation between head and hand, intellectual and manual labor. We need to overcome that alienation between how we live and our environment, because we should not live against our environment. We should live with our environment, you know, and we can do that again if we begin to challenge this hierarchical model of society, which says the rich are rich because they deserve to be rich, even though they don't, and they don't do a stitch of work to be rich. They're actually rich because they own, not because they work. And we say that being rich should not be the objective of your life. The objective of your life should be, how do I live with my environment and with my community, to the benefit of my environment and my community, and in the process getting benefit from my environment and my community as an equal person to everyone else, rather than as someone in competition with everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why, you know, in the timber industry in our area, there's still one team of horses and mules, which is still active in one of the plantations. I mean, that's that's something that sorry.
You know, that area has these Bokoni ruins and so on that are there. That area has got such an amazing heritage. Yeah. And like you say, you know, like you said in the beginning, we need to get back to some of the traditional ways of healing, the traditional ways of living and feeding and so on. Obviously, there was also problems with traditional ways. We can't overlook that many of these societies were very patriarchal, very discriminatory, and so on. But not everything they did was wrong. You know, if you look at the Tswana word for medicine, setlare or ditlare, it's the same as plant. Plant equals medicine. Medicine equals plant. I met the great-grandson of the last rainmaker of Gaditshwene, which was an old Iron Age town near Zeerust that the Reverend John Campbell visited. And he was in his 80s, and he was very, very sprightly and healthy and so on. And I said to him, living very simply in a place called Bakubung. And I said to him, how is it that you are still so healthy? And he said to me, I've never been to a Western doctor in my entire life. I've never been inside a pharmacy. I get my medicine from my environment.
Yeah, and now that's become so difficult for many people to do. I mean, even us that live in an area which is still relatively, there's some natural wilderness, semi-wilderness here, but it's being degraded from all sides, bush encroachment, soil erosion, biodiversity impoverishment. It's just incredible, the onslaught.
There's policy gap 11 that we wrote about called Life Before and During Mining, looking at Sekhukhune land. And such a beautiful place, Sekhukhune land, but it's getting so messed up now with chrome and platinum and everything else that's being mined there. And we looked at the biodiversity of that area, the incredible wealth of plants, both in terms of nutrition as well as health and other uses that are just being wiped out completely as a result of this obsession with growth and profit. And it's very sad, because it's also an area with lots of water, but the water is also being depleted because for every open cast mine that you have to make a ring of boreholes around the mine to drop the water table, so as to allow for dry working conditions. And so the farmers in the area, the peasant farmers, the subsistence farmers, the self-sustaining farmers, suddenly find their boreholes and wells drying up because the water table is dropped. And then because suddenly there was a shortage of water, they built the De Hoop Dam, and the De Hoop Dam blocked the river that flowed through these communities. And they put on pipes to all the mines to make sure that the mines get water, but they didn't put pipes to the villages. In any case, cattle don't drink from a pipe, they drink from a river. And so the cattle die, and the cattle culture collapses, and the self-sustaining agriculture collapses, and people are left destitute. They have no skills for a modern economy, and the environment for their own economy is no longer there to sustain them.
Is there anybody in the chat that wants to ask David a question or want to comment on anything that he said up to this time? Anybody? Robbie, you've got another question?
It's Brian. David, you mentioned earlier on your work in Mozambique around coal. What about the impacts of coal in South Africa as well? And what role is the Asian markets providing for the continued support of this extraction? Because we've seen you mentioned the water table and the Witwatersrand. Mining companies are now looking at trying to make inroads into the water protected area just down the road from Phillip.
The Mabola court case, where the government in 2012 declared the area a protected area, and then in 2014 gives a mining license. We've been part of the struggle against those licenses being issued in Mpumalanga. You see, the global economy is so integrated that you have Glencore, for example, which is owned by Canadians, Swiss, and the Chinese Development Bank. People like to sort of isolate a particular country for battering, when in actual fact all these companies are integrated globally. And whatever coal goes into China produces the junk that goes into Europe, or that forms the the component parts of your cell phone, or the component parts of your laptop, or the component parts of your car, and so on. China is basically the cheap labor factory for the rest of the world, and the global economy is entirely reliant on China. No matter what Trump or Bush or anyone else has to say, we've got a globally integrated economy, and it's an economy that's driven by consumerism, and each part of that economy is part of the rest of that global economy, and we're going to have to dismantle it in terms of also these ownership structures that we are having. But the Olifants River and other rivers in Mpumalanga are under serious threat, and we are actually murdering the rivers in this country. I mean, the Vaal River, farmers as far away as Kuruman get tailings from Johannesburg deposited on their land every year. There's a flood. When the Orange River comes down, the Gariep River comes down, and it affects the fertility. It makes their swale saline, and they can no longer plant their crops and so on there. The same thing with Mpumalanga, because the Olifants River, I think, flows into the Limpopo River, and so it actually is pollution that affects 3 different countries. It affects Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa, and we have to look at water in an integrated way. In Southern Africa, just like the Okavango swamp, swamps here, and the delta being mined for oil is going to affect all other African countries. So the impact on the Limpopo River affects a number of countries and not just one country. And if we look at South Africa, we have a real problem because we are responsible for 98% of the continent's air pollution. We are responsible for 86% of the continent's general pollution. We are really, really, really a bad example for the rest of Africa, and our politicians want the rest of Africa to follow our example. If I go to Mozambique, if I go to Zimbabwe, if I go to Kenya, everyone wants to imitate the South African model of economic empowerment, of a new rich elite that is in alliance with global capital, basically to plunder the continent and destroy its environment. And we all look down upon the villager who lives there in the middle of the bush in Solwezi, when in fact that villager lives in a much more sustainable way than any of us. But yes, your point about Mpumalanga is well taken, and it's a struggle that we are engaged in. The MEC for the environment there has now taken away the protected status from that area where this outfit from India wants to mine coal.
Sure. David, thanks. I see that we've gone much over the time that we're almost to 2 hours, and I thank you very much for your patience and for the time. If you allow me, I just want to quickly reflect upon China as a superpower, and sometimes we have this idea that a lot of the exploitation of African minerals. Now, I take your point about the global interconnectiveness, and China being the chief producer of vital components of equipment being used in the West. But for example, traveling through Mozambique and looking at the massive deforestation that was going on there, and realizing that a lot of that was being told that a huge percentage of the timber there was being exported to China. The coal in South Africa, a lot of it going to China, I think. So, just your thoughts on China's role in the African economy over the next couple of decades.
Well, I think there are 2 or 3 points to make about China. It's in the first instance, for example, I work in the Congo and in Zambia and so on, and very often I fly. And there were times when the cheapest flights were Air Zimbabwe, and I would get on the plane in Johannesburg and land in Harare. In Harare, everyone would get off the plane except me, and then the plane would be filled with Chinese people, and we would fly to Zambia. And in Lusaka, the Chinese people would all get off, and I would be pretty much on my own in this big plane all the way to Katanga. And so yet we don't see that prevalence of Chinese involvement in Africa and in South Africa. Why is that? The reason is that in South Africa we have strong trade unions, and trade unions won't allow cheap labor from China to land by the planeful at OR Tambo, and from there to work in factories and mines and so on in South Africa as they do in Zambia. So what happens in Africa is what African politicians allow to happen and what African people allow to happen. If you have a strong trade union movement in Zambia, for example, you would not have this phenomenon in the Zambian context. In South Africa, when you've got Chinese mining companies coming into South Africa, they come in as part of consortia of Western, Canadian, Australian, Chinese, American companies. And I can take you out to Rustenburg. I'll show you some of the smelters there. They fly the Chinese flag, the Canadian flag, the American flag, all next to each other. Okay, so and the Chinese Development Bank, for example, owns Standard Bank. And Standard Bank is the biggest investor in mining in Africa. And Standard Bank finances Canadian and Australian outfits and so on. I'm pretty sure that they are financing the mess in the Okavango Delta. And I opposed the mine with benchmarks in Kayelekera, Karonga on the northern part of Malawi, right next to the lake, where an Australian company started a uranium mine up on the escarpment, and all that rubbish flowed down into Lake Malawi, and now the fish in that area is completely dead. The fishermen don't have any more work to do because they can no longer catch fish because the uranium pollution that came off the escarpment into the lake stopped that. A company called Paladin. Now, we discovered that it was Standard Bank that financed Paladin. So I don't think that we can see China in isolation. China is part of a global system. It's an integral part of the machinery of a global system. But again, like I said at an earlier point, there are good things and there are bad things about China. There are some things about China that are good. If I go to Lusaka, for example, and I look at the number of hospitals they built and the number of schools and things that they've built, they've done far more than the British. If I go to the DRC and to Angola and so on, if I go to southern Angola that we bombed to hell during the Angolan War, and I went there in 2008 for the commemoration of the Cuito Cuanavalle battle, and it took us 2 days to drive 100 kilometers because of the bomb craters and so on in the roads that were still there. Yeah. If you go there now, it's smooth driving. The roads are all there. The Chinese built them. If you go to Monongwe, which was also bombed to hell during the war, Monongwe has been fixed up. Its electricity supply is there. Its administrative buildings have been repaired. And it's not South Africa who repaired them. It's the Chinese.
But I mean, the Chinese are not doing that for nothing.
Well, I think that if you look at scope and if you look at fact check and so on the issue of Lusaka Airport belongs to the Chinese, it's rubbish. It's not true. Or that the harbor in Dar es Salaam belongs to the Chinese, it's rubbish. It's not true. But they are not doing it for nothing. They are doing it for trade. Unlike the Americans who occupy Africa with AFRICOM, you don't find Chinese bases all over Africa, but you find Chinese business all over Africa.
Okay,
now, I don't know which one is more. I don't know which one is. I don't know which one is worse. But that is the difference.
But because unfortunately, the trade is not based on it's based on mostly just raw resources being shipped out.
Yes, they take raw resources because the companies like what is this young billionaire from South Africa that wants to go to Mars?
Oh, Musk.
Yeah, he's
Musk.
heavily invested in China. This chap from Pretoria Boys High
Yeah.
who wants to go up to Mars.
SpaceX. Elon Musk. Yeah.
Musk, Elon.
Yeah.
Elon is massively invested in China. That's why Elon put all his money behind Biden rather than Trump, because he knew that the relationships with China would improve and his investments in China would be secure. Mainly because the area that he's invested in needs spare parts and small component parts and so on to be produced by Chinese cheap labor.
Yeah.
So it brings me back to the point. Where does the raw materials go? Our manganese goes mainly to China. It goes to China. Why? Because Musk and them are very much into renewable energy. Well, it's not really renewable. It's not really sustainable either. I call it alternative energy.
Yeah.
They're very into alternative energy. So they don't want a warmonger like Trump in the White House, because they can't afford a war with China, because all their factories will get bombed.
Yeah. Sure. No, it's really interesting dynamics, and it's a huge problem. But I mean, everywhere you find people like yourself, like your organization or foundation that you work with, people pointing out, because I think one of the first issues really is that we must recognize that there's a problem. I think many people don't think there's a problem and think everything is a-okay, But that's a first step, of course, is to recognize a problem before you can start doing something about it. But yeah, it's a massive problem, and it's going to take us a lot of critical thinking to get out of it. Can I ask if there's anybody on this call that wants to just add another comment or a question? Robbie, Brian, welcome.
Hi.
Yo, Rob.
No, I was restraining because of the time. There's a lot of questions I'd like to ask. It's been a very interesting conversation. Thanks, David. I guess one thing I wanted to comment on is, we spoke earlier, or you spoke earlier, about a move towards more community-based governance, really, smaller local scale, where you can actually, the decisions that get made and the impacts or benefits is seen by the people that actually make the decisions. And I definitely agree with a more local model, more personal model, where people are around you are responsible for what goes on around you. But what do you think the role of, how do you go about implementing that, really kind of creating, because we're at the moment, the world is really messed up. We have crazy urbanization and urban sprawl, and where urban sprawl is happening, it's been terribly planned. And to move away from that, it seems like it would take a lot of planning. And or do you disagree? Do you think that's something that would organically happen given the right political situation or scenarios?
I have aversion to professional politicians, because I think politics should be everybody's business and not that of a professional class of politicians. In Riverlee, what we've done with that community is we've gotten them to form a community cooperative. Everyone in the community belongs to the cooperative, and to take charge of their own development issues through that cooperative. It's very much at the inception stages. The cooperative was only registered a few weeks ago, and they are very energetic, and they're very excited about it. And they've already started tackling issues of the surrounding destruction caused by mining and so on. And a part of that project is going to be an urban agriculture project, where they are going to plant a plant called Hibiscus cannabis. It's a plant that absorbs heavy metals in its roots. The plant itself has many different uses. You can make cloth from it. You can eat the leaves. You can make BMW's dashboards are made from it from huge plantations that are grown in China, but it's actually an African plant. And in South Africa, we've not realized the potential of that plant. Now, in Riverlee, the river that runs past Riverlee, the Russell Spruit, that runs into the Klip Spruit and into the Klip River, is absolutely polluted with mine tailings waste. You know, it's just this yellow sand all over the river. And what we want to do is we want to plant this crop in the river banks up to the railway line where Riverlee is, and try and extract all the heavy metals from the soil there, so that the soil can become useful again, and the river can become rehabilitated in the process of taking out the heavy metals and so on. But we also need the mining company that is there to remove the mine dumps that are there, because every year with the rain season, the erosion of those dumps goes straight back into the river. And because the riverbed has been raised, it causes flooding in Riverlee every year. And we can't solve the flooding problem unless we solve the problem of the siltation of the river with mine waste that is happening all the time. But what is exciting for me is just how eager the people there are to take this whole thing forward and to begin to find solutions to their own problems. The only problem is that suddenly an ultra-right-wing organization called the Patriotic Alliance arrived on the scene, and I got death threats from them in November, and they are now making threats against members of the community because they won a local government election with a minority of people participating in that election. People don't participate in elections anymore because they don't see the value of it. You know, the elections for local, provincial, and national government, no one participates anymore because they don't see any change in their lives, and they don't believe that politicians are interested in making the changes that are necessary. And therefore, it's important to convince people that they themselves can make those changes if they start taking responsibility for what is happening in their communities and around them. But then we must get the thugs out of politics, you know. I don't know how the IEC registered the Patriotic Alliance, because its leader is a guy called Gayton McKenzie, who has got a criminal record. I didn't know that criminals can stand for election. You know, so yeah, it's a tough one, but it's something that we have to do. We don't have any more choices. We've run out of time, basically.
It's also just that, you know, people can only make good decisions about their lives and changes to the environment if they have decent information to base those decisions on. So, and I think that's really why your work is also so valuable, because I think you really, with the social media, you've got, I think, quite a large following, and I think that's a great platform to make people just think, you know, and spur some debate. I think it's very valuable, and I want to thank you for your role as you as an individual. You know, apart from benchmarks, or just you as an individual, and with the posts and the comments and the discussions that you generate. We are way beyond our time. I thank you very much again, David. I want to ask if there's anybody, Brian, you want to unmute, have a last question for David, or Robbie, you want to say anything else before we conclude? David, do you have a final comment?
Well, yeah, I think that, you know, on the issue of social media, I think we have to use as much platforms as possible to get an alternative narrative out into the public, and for people to start talking about an alternative narrative and an alternative vision, one that is more centered on the person in the community and the community in the person, and that is where we start to build that new vision of society and work and begin to work towards it, and of a different kind of economy and so on. You know, sometimes one has to be idealistic in order to effect change, because if we just all sit and say, but there's nothing I can do about it, this is how it is, this is how it always was, and this is how it always will be, then we are just defeatist. We cannot afford to be defeatist.
Yes. I don't know if you're talking about social media, how Sibongile Mangoma with I'm for the arts movement. I mean, they've been sitting there in the, they've been involved in a sit-in. They've basically taken over the building, the National Association of the Arts building, and yeah, they're demanding transparency on, because apparently there's 300 million rand that's been allocated, but they want to know where's this money gone to. And it's just incredible to see how social media has played a role in that particular activism for the arts.
Yeah, there's 50 billion rands available for closing down abandoned mines, and it's not being used, and that money is going to disappear.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I thank you very much. Have a nice evening, and thank you very much for your time. And thanks to the other people that's on this call. And we will. It's been recorded, and I will put it up on YouTube tomorrow, and then disseminate the link. But David,
Thank you so
again,
much.
Thank
Really
you very
appreciate
much. Thank you. Okay.
You be well, and look after yourself.
Thank you, and you. Glad you recovered from COVID.
I'm so glad I recovered from it. But it's the social media that helped me to recover. You know, those 30,000 people who are followers and the 5,000 supporters and so on, those people raise money like you won't believe.
Yeah. And I mean, apart from the money, just the emotional support, I think, is also incredibly valuable, you know.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Positive kind of energy that's healing.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, no, thank you so much. You have a good night.
Have a good evening, and thanks for the time. Stop.
All right. Cheers, Paul.
Hey, jy nog daar?
Ag, nou 10 uur afgaan, so.
Ek wil die recording stop.